Have you ever found a recipe that you loved and then modified over time? Maybe you needed to halve or double the recipe. Perhaps you had to substitute ingredients because you didn't have the ones required on hand. It could be that over time you've added in your own personal touches. A dash more of this, a pinch less of that. The same is true for your podcast. The recipe you use when you start your podcast may change over time to suit the needs of your listeners, as well as your needs as a hostess. We're spicing things up today and in the upcoming 3 episodes of the podcast with a brand new mini-series. We'll be diving into the many ingredients or spices you'll need, and you'll get to make some choices so that you can build a strong foundation for your podcast. To help you craft your forthcoming podcast and get the very most out of this 4-episode mini-series, head over to yongpratt.com/workbook and grab my Podcasting Foundations workbook so you can start building and crafting your podcast today. Until now, this workbook has only been available to students inside of Podcast in a Weekend, which is my most popular class in my In a Weekend class series. Until October 24th, 2019, this workbook is yours for only $9. Once you've completed it, you'll have the foundational elements you need to launch your very own podcast. Welcome to episode number 241 of the In a Weekend podcast. I'm your host, Yong Pratt, and I help female business owners launch and grow their podcasts quickly and easily with content automation so that they can grow their audiences, expand their reach, and gain more clients. It's been said that variety is the spice of life. Well, the same can definitely be said about your podcasting life. According to the website writingexplained.org, the original phrase is actually, variety is the spice of life, which gives it all its flavor. The phrase was written in 1875 by William Cowper in his poem entitled The Task. While the poem compares unseasoned food to an unexciting life, the phrase itself has become a metaphor to explain that adding spice, i.e. variety, to one's life keeps it from becoming boring. And nobody wants to be boring, especially on a podcast. Today we're diving into some of the spices you can add to your podcast to give it variety, to heat things up, or to mellow things out with a few dashes here and there. A few weeks ago, I shared a serendipitous experience I had here locally. I ran into someone that I hadn't seen in probably over a dozen years. As it turns out, we're now both working in the online space and she wants to start a podcast. And since then, these types of serendipitous events have continued to present themselves regularly. If you don't already know, I'm an avid reader and collector of books in print form, ebooks, and my favorite recently, audiobooks. One of the books I'm currently reading is called Big Podcast. Grow your podcast audience, build listener loyalty, and get everybody talking about your show by David Hooper. In all honesty, I've actually been reading this book for a while now, as it's a 400-plus page instruction guide, and I'm about halfway through. 2 weeks ago, as I was waiting to pick up my youngest from drama rehearsal, I grabbed David's book from the back seat. Yes, books travel with me, and I opened up the book to where I left off previously. As I dove into the first few pages of chapter 19, David introduced a term called taste master. At the time, the title of this podcast episode, Variety is the Spice in Your Podcasting Life, hadn't really taken shape fully. I knew I wanted to dive into the many choices you as a podcaster get to make, yet I wasn't really happy with the generic names for the topics I wanted to cover with you. As a podcaster, you're in the driver's seat. You get to call the shots and make up your own recipes as the taste master of your show. You have the ability to add, to decrease, or leave out spices as you see fit to ensure that your podcast suits the tastes of your listeners, as well as the tastes as the hostess of your show. Today, we're going to dive into 2 of these spices: the type of show you want to create and your show's personality. Be sure to grab the Podcasting Foundation's workbook so that you can keep track of all your choices in one place as you craft your podcast and prepare for launch. While there are a variety of show types, generally speaking, there are 4 main formats you can create: the solo show, the interview show, the co-hosted or panel show, or a combination of the above. Let's dive into each show type to make your decision process a little bit easier. The solo show, number 1. You are the one and only expert on your solo show. You share your knowledge and your experiences with your listeners. If you're already an established expert in a particular niche, like websites, Facebook ads, or more, a solo show can make a lot of sense. You're providing targeted episodes based on a central theme. When I first started my podcast back in 2013, I created a solo show. It was me, myself, and I for every episode. And while that can definitely be an advantage, it can also be a little trickier to always be constantly coming up with topics for your podcast. Type number 2, the interview-based podcast. If you don't want to be the only featured expert on your podcast, conducting interviews is a great way to go. Now, you'll really need to hone your skills as an interviewer to make this format successful for you. Plus, you'll need to add in extra time to your workflow or assign someone on your team to schedule guests, correspond with them, and more. Having a solid guesting system is a must. If you're interested in creating your own guesting system for your podcast, it's something I cover in detail inside of my M3, my Multiply My Message membership. The only way to get access to the membership is by becoming a Podcast in a Weekend graduate. And yes, Podcast in a Weekend is coming up October 25th through 27th. Podcast type number 3, the co-hosted or panel discussion podcast. As the name implies, there is more than one host for this type of podcast, or perhaps even a larger panel to create episodes. The ability and time to coordinate multiple schedules to record each podcast may become a challenge. On the flip side, however, having more than one voice provides a diversity of viewpoints for your listener. And show type number 4, the combination podcast. This is my personal favorite type of podcast to create. While I have many solo episodes, I do like to sprinkle in guests that I feel will benefit all of you, my dear listeners. And on occasion, I'll even add in a dash of multiple guests or panels on a podcast. In my personal experience, though, these types of panel-based or multiple guest episodes are definitely challenging to coordinate. It's likely that the type of show format you choose will in fact lend itself somewhat to the culture of your show, and your personality will shine through. However, it's wise to decide upon a distinct personality. Here are some examples of different personalities that your show can take. A broadcast show. a documentary, a comedy show, a show based in science, a true crime show, storytelling, fiction, advice column, and more. There's so many different types of personalities that will kind of dictate how you structure your podcast at the end of the day. So, my friends, now it's your turn to dive in and craft your forthcoming podcast. Grab a copy of my Podcasting Foundations workbook at yongpratt.com/workbook while it's still available for only $9. Set aside some time today to brainstorm and decide upon the type of podcast you want to create, along with its personality or culture. Once you've chosen the unique spices that will make up your podcast, come on over to yongpratt.com and share them with me. I am super excited to learn the types of spices your podcast is going to have. Before I wrap up this episode, I want to say this. If at any point during your podcasting journey, you find that the type of podcast you want to create or its culture doesn't quite suit your listeners or yourself as podcast hostess, you're absolutely free to make changes. A dash of this, a pinch of that, and your podcast will become a finely tuned favorite. Next week, I have 3 podcasts coming your way as we continue this mini-series entitled Variety is the Spice in Your Podcasting Life. I'll have bonus episodes for you on Monday and Tuesday, along with a live Q&A Wednesday that will hit the podcast on our regular release day, Thursday. Until then, be sure to go and grab my Podcasting Foundations workbook for just $9 at yongpratt.com/workbook so that you can start diving in and crafting your podcast starting today. With the workbook and this mini-series here on the podcast, you'll be launching your podcast in no time. With the purchase of the workbook, you'll unlock special savings for the upcoming session of Podcast in a Weekend, which is coming your way October 25th through 27th. Cheers, my friends.